For decades, the Italian Mafia stood as the undisputed king of organized crime in America. From the back rooms of New York's Little Italy to the glittering casinos of Las Vegas, their power seemed absolute, rooted in fear, loyalty, and a code of silence. But history tells us something different. The Mafia's throne was never unshakable. Rival gangs, Irish, Jewish, Black, Latino, and even fellow Italians, rose up to test their strength. Some fought for territory, others for money, and a few simply for survival. These clashes didn't just expose cracks in the Mafia's empire. They helped reshape the entire underworld. This is the story of 5 times gangs dared to challenge the Italian Mafia, the Irish mob versus the Italian Mafia. At the dawn of the 20th century, America's underworld was still up for grabs. New York, Boston, and Chicago were teeming with immigrant neighborhoods, each bringing its own street gangs and ethnic rivalries. Long before the Italian Mafia became synonymous with organized crime, it was the Irish mob that held sway. Tough, streetwise, and deeply entrenched in local politics, Irish gangsters were the first to show how organized crime could become a business. But the Italians were rising fast, and soon these two worlds would collide. The Prohibition era, launched in 1920, was the powder keg. Suddenly, alcohol was illegal, and overnight it became the most lucrative black market commodity in America. For the Irish mob, this was their golden age. In Chicago, Dean O'Banion's North Side gang controlled speakeasies and breweries, while in New York, Oney Madden and his men dominated Hell's Kitchen. Irish crews leveraged their political connections with police and city officials, keeping their bootlegging operations thriving. But the Italians, organized, ambitious, and connected to immigrant communities just as desperate for opportunity, were about to change the balance of power. No figure symbolized this shift more than Al Capone. Rising through the Italian-American South Side gang in Chicago, Capone and his allies saw Prohibition as the ultimate empire-building opportunity. When their interests clashed with O'Banion's North Side Irish, blood filled the streets. In 1924, O'Banion was assassinated in his flower shop, allegedly by Capone's men. The killing ignited years of open warfare between Irish and Italian factions, culminating in the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre of 1929. 7 Irish gangsters were gunned down in broad daylight by Capone's men, an event that shocked the nation and cemented Italian dominance in Chicago. The Irish mob, once powerful, never fully recovered. In New York, the picture was slightly different. The Irish retained strongholds in Hell's Kitchen and the docks, with gangs like the Gophers and later the Westies carving out reputations for brutality. Oney Madden, an Irish mobster with a knack for blending violence and business, built an empire that extended from speakeasies to boxing promotions. But even Madden, known as the Killer of Hell's Kitchen, had to deal with the growing might of Italian families. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano and his allies were restructuring the Italian underworld, transforming it into a national criminal syndicate with clear rules, hierarchy, and vision. Where the Irish had often thrived on raw muscle and political ties, the Italians brought discipline and organization. Luciano's creation of the Commission in 1931 effectively institutionalized Italian control, giving the Mafia a level of coordination no other ethnic gang could match. The Irish, despite their toughness, lacked this nationwide structure. Their power remained localized, leaving them vulnerable as the Italians expanded. Still, the Irish didn't vanish. In Boston, the McLaughlin and Winter Hill gangs carried the torch, engaging in bloody wars of their own well into the 1960s. Figures like Whitey Bulger showed that the Irish could adapt, using a combination of fear and informant networks to survive in a mafia-dominated era. But these were remnants of a once greater influence. The truth was that by the mid-20th century, the Italian mafia had eclipsed the Irish in nearly every major city. Yet the early confrontations between the Irish mob and the Italians shaped the very foundation of organized crime in America. The Irish proved that crime could be organized, profitable, and politically protected. The Italians learned from this example and then perfected it, expanding from bootlegging to gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering. The battles of the 1920s were not just gangland skirmishes. They were the death throes of one empire and the birth pangs of another. When the dust settled, the Italian mafia reigned supreme. But it owed its rise in part to the challenge and competition the Irish mob had once posed. The Irish had shown how to build an underworld kingdom. The Italians simply built a bigger one. The Jewish mob versus the Italian mafia. By the 1930s, the Italian mafia had begun consolidating its grip on the American underworld. But in New York, Chicago, and beyond, there was another powerful force they couldn't simply brush aside: the Jewish mob. Unlike the Irish, whose influence waned after Prohibition, Jewish gangsters weren't just rivals. They were partners, equals, and sometimes adversaries of the Italians. Together, they reshaped organized crime into a national enterprise. The roots of Jewish organized crime were similar to those of the Italians. Poor immigrants packed into ethnic neighborhoods where crime often became the quickest way out of poverty. From Manhattan's Lower East Side emerged figures like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, street-tough kids who rose through petty theft and gambling before setting their sights on bigger things. During Prohibition, Jewish and Italian gangs often worked together in bootlegging operations. Arnold Rothstein, a Jewish gambler and racketeer, financed liquor shipments and taught younger protégés, Lansky, Siegel, and others, that organized crime was less about brawling and more about business. When Rothstein was murdered in 1928, his successors carried on his legacy, fusing Jewish ingenuity with Italian muscle. But cooperation did not mean subordination. The Jewish mob could be just as ruthless, just as ambitious. In the 1930s, Lansky and Siegel teamed up with Italian bosses Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello to create Murder, Inc. This enforcement arm, based in Brooklyn, carried out contract killings for the Mafia, but it was largely staffed by Jewish hitmen like Abe Kid Twist Reyes, Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, and Lepke Buchhalter. Murder, Inc. became the most feared gangland assassination squad in America, proving the Jewish mob was indispensable to Mafia power. Still, rivalry simmered beneath the surface. Lansky and Siegel pushed hard into the gambling world, from New York to Miami and Havana. When Siegel spearheaded the creation of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, it was a bold move that unsettled some Italian bosses. Siegel envisioned Vegas as a gambling mecca, a vision later realized by the Mafia. But his reckless spending and alleged skimming of profits angered his partners. In 1947, Siegel was assassinated in Beverly Hills, most likely on Mafia orders. His death marked the Mafia's determination to keep Jewish partners in check. Despite Siegel's downfall, Lansky thrived. A financial genius with a reputation for honesty among criminals, Lansky became the mob's unofficial banker. He handled money laundering schemes, built casino networks in Havana, and forged international connections that made him untouchable for decades. His influence within the Mafia's financial empire was so great that many historians argue the Italians needed him as much as he needed them. The relationship between the Jewish mob and the Italians was one of mutual dependency. The Italians brought structure, hierarchy, and control of unions and rackets. The Jews contributed brains, innovation, and connections that stretched far beyond immigrants' neighborhoods. Yet tensions were inevitable. Italians insisted on dominance within the Commission, the Mafia's governing body, while Jewish gangsters had to operate outside of it. In Chicago, similar dynamics played out. Jewish gangster Jack Greasy Thumb Guzik was Al Capone's trusted advisor, handling the finances while Capone wielded the gun. In Cleveland, Mo Dalitz transitioned from bootlegging to building casinos, often working side by side with Italian partners. In each case, Jewish mobsters were not mere foot soldiers. They were architects of America's organized crime economy. But by the 1950s and 1960s, the Jewish mob began to fade as the Mafia entrenched itself through the Commission and expanded into narcotics. Jewish gangsters increasingly left the street rackets for more legitimate enterprises. Lansky himself lived long enough to see the Mafia reach its peak, only to fall under FBI pressure in the 1970s. Still, the legacy of the Jewish mob is clear. Without them, the Mafia's empire would never have grown so vast. They were collaborators, competitors, and visionaries who pushed organized crime beyond its immigrant roots and into the modern era. For a time, the Italian Mafia and the Jewish mob were uneasy allies, bound together by profit and necessity. But in the end, it was the Italians who claimed the throne, while the Jewish mob, though diminished, left behind a blueprint for the global underworld. The Mafia may have ruled the streets, but the Jewish mob helped them build the empire. The Westies versus the Gambino family. By the 1970s, the Italian Mafia was at the height of its power. The five families of New York had their hands in everything: unions, construction, drugs, gambling, and loan sharking. To outsiders, their control seemed absolute. But in the heart of Manhattan, in the gritty streets of Hell's Kitchen, a band of Irish gangsters emerged who refused to bow completely to Mafia authority. They were called the Westies, a gang so violent, so unpredictable, that even the powerful Gambino family had to treat them with caution. The Westies traced their roots to the Irish immigrant community of Hell's Kitchen, a working-class neighborhood on Manhattan's West Side. Poverty, overcrowding, and hard living gave rise to tough young men who relied on their fists and later guns to carve out territory. By the mid-20th century, the Irish hold on organized crime had waned. But in Hell's Kitchen, the tradition survived. When Jimmy Coonan rose to lead the Westies in the 1970s, he injected the gang with new life and terrifying brutality. Coonan was no ordinary gangster. Charismatic but ruthless, he enforced loyalty through fear. Under his leadership, the Westies became infamous for their savage methods. Enemies weren't just killed, they were dismembered, their bodies chopped into pieces to make identification difficult. This macabre practice struck fear across Hell's Kitchen, ensuring silence from potential witnesses. In the underworld, the Westies quickly earned a reputation as some of the most violent men in New York. But raw violence alone wasn't enough to secure lasting power. The Italians controlled the big rackets, construction unions, gambling dens, and lucrative loan sharking operations. If the Westies wanted to survive, they needed an alliance. Enter Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family. Castellano saw the Westies not as competitors, but as useful enforcers. By aligning with the Irish gang, he gained loyal muscle on the West Side, while Coonan secured access to Mafia-controlled rackets. The partnership was uneasy from the start. Castellano's Gambinos valued order and discipline, while the Westies thrived on chaos. Yet the alliance worked for a time. The Westies collected debts, ran protection rackets, and shared profits with the Gambinos. In return, they gained Mafia protection and a share of the lucrative union contracts flowing through Manhattan. Still, the Westies never fully bent the knee. Their sheer unpredictability kept the Italians wary. Unlike the Mafia, which followed a strict code of silence and loyalty, the Westies were prone to drunken outbursts, impulsive killings, and reckless behavior. They brought heat from the police in ways the Mafia considered dangerous, but they were also too useful to discard. When Castellano wanted a message sent, the Westies delivered, brutally. As the 1980s dawned, however, the alliance began to crack. Law enforcement was stepping up its war against organized crime, using new RICO laws to target Mafia leaders and their associates. The Westies' brazen violence drew attention, and federal prosecutors soon had them in their sights. The FBI infiltrated the gang through informants, peeling back the curtain on their bloody reign. The downfall came quickly. Coonan and his top lieutenants were indicted on racketeering, murder, and conspiracy charges. Testimony from former members revealed the grisly details of their crimes, dismemberments, extortions, and countless murders carried out in the name of power. By the mid-1980s, the Westies were dismantled, their reign of terror brought to an end. For the Gambinos, the fall of the Westies was both a relief and a liability. On one hand, the Irish gang's recklessness had always been a problem. On the other, their removal left the Mafia without its most feared enforcers in Hell's Kitchen. The alliance had been short-lived, but it demonstrated something important. The Mafia, for all its power, sometimes needed outsiders. The Westies never became a national force like the Italians, but in their corner of New York, they challenged Mafia dominance in a way few others dared. They proved that even at the height of Italian power, there were gangs too wild, too violent, and too stubborn to be fully controlled. In the end, the Gambinos may have had the empire, but the Westies left behind a legacy of fear, a reminder that, in the underworld, chaos sometimes demands respect. The Black Guerrilla family and the prison gangs versus the Italian Mafia. By the 1970s, the Italian Mafia controlled unions, rackets, and street crime across America. But inside prison walls, the story was very different. There, power wasn't determined by the commission, but by who could survive day to day in a brutal, racially divided world. And in that world, new players rose, prison gangs that didn't care about Mafia tradition, bloodlines, or codes of silence. Among the most powerful was the Black Guerrilla family, a revolutionary group that directly challenged Mafia members behind bars, reshaping the balance of power in America's prisons. The Black Guerrilla family, or BGF, was founded in 1966 at San Quentin State Prison by George Jackson, a charismatic Black Panther and Marxist revolutionary. For Jackson and his followers, the BGF wasn't just a gang, it was a political movement. They combined ideology with ruthless discipline, recruiting from among Black inmates who were often marginalized, brutalized, or ignored by prison authorities. Their stated goal was the overthrow of the U.S. government. But in practice, they became one of the most feared criminal organizations behind bars. The Italian Mafia, by contrast, had always thrived on the outside. Prison time was often considered a temporary setback for mobsters, not a permanent battlefield. Mafia members who landed in state or federal lockups tried to rely on the same rules they followed on the street: respect, silence, hierarchy. But in prison, those rules meant little. Numbers, racial solidarity, and sheer violence dictated survival. As the 1970s unfolded, prisons across the United States erupted with racial tension. The BGF squared off against white gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, turning cell blocks into war zones. In this new environment, Italian mobsters, few in number compared to black and Hispanic inmates, were forced to pick sides or risk annihilation. While some mobsters aligned with the Aryan Brotherhood for protection, others found themselves directly clashing with the BGF over control of contraband, drugs, and influence within the prison system. The Mafia, used to being the dominant force on the outside, quickly realized it had limited leverage inside. The BGF and other prison gangs, such as the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood, had organizational structures tailored for prison life. They controlled the flow of drugs, enforced discipline among their members, and struck with shocking violence at anyone who crossed them. For a mobster used to giving orders from the top down, adapting to this new ecosystem was a humbling experience. The BGF's reach extended far beyond prison walls. Members maintained communication with allies on the street, fueling heroin distribution networks and enforcing control over black neighborhoods. Their ideology may have been revolutionary, but their operations were pure organized crime. This gave them staying power and resources that rivaled and sometimes surpassed those of the Mafia inside certain institutions. Stories from federal prisons in the 1970s and 1980s highlight the tensions. Mobsters who had been feared captains on the streets of New York found themselves outnumbered and vulnerable. Deals had to be cut, alliances forged, and tribute paid. In some cases, Mafia members begrudgingly acknowledged the authority of BGF leaders to avoid bloodshed. The once unshakable image of Mafia dominance crumbled in the face of prison gangs who held the real power behind bars. For law enforcement, the rise of the BGF and similar gangs presented a new challenge. While the FBI and federal prosecutors focused much of their energy on dismantling the Italian Mafia in cities like New York and Chicago, prison gangs were quietly building empires of their own. By the 1990s, the BGF was deeply entrenched in both California prisons and urban drug markets, operating with a discipline and ferocity that echoed the Mafia's own rise decades earlier. The clash between the BGF and Mafia members inside prison walls was never a formal war. It was something more revealing, a reminder that power in the underworld is always situational. On the streets, the Mafia may have been kings. But in the yard, in the cell block, and in the mess hall, it was prison gangs like the Black Guerrilla family that set the rules. The Mafia survived in prison by adapting, by cutting deals, and by acknowledging realities it couldn't control. But its aura of absolute dominance was shattered. For the first time, mobsters were just one gang among many. And that shift signaled a new era in organized crime, one where the Mafia would no longer hold all the cards. The Mexican Mafia and Latino gangs versus the Italian Mafia. By the 1980s, the Italian Mafia was still powerful, but the world around it was changing. Drugs had become the lifeblood of organized crime, and new players were rising who were younger, more ruthless, and better suited for the streets. In California, one gang in particular seized control of entire neighborhoods and prison yards. The Mexican Mafia, also known as La IM. What began as a small prison gang evolved into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America, directly challenging the Mafia's claim as the supreme force in organized crime. The Mexican Mafia was born in 1957 inside the walls of Duell Vocational Institution, a California prison. A group of Mexican-American inmates, frustrated by harassment from other gangs and prison officials, banded together for protection. But protection quickly grew into something bigger. Within years, La M had become a tightly organized syndicate inside the prison system, enforcing loyalty through extreme violence and controlling the flow of contraband. What set the Mexican Mafia apart was its ability to extend its influence beyond prison walls. By the 1970s and 1980s, La M controlled Latino street gangs across Southern California, uniting them under a single authority. Their system was simple but effective. Gangs on the outside had to pay a tax on drug sales and criminal activity. Those who refused risked death. In this way, the Mexican Mafia turned fragmented street crews into a revenue machine that funneled money back into prisons, fueling their expansion. This rise posed a direct challenge to the Italian Mafia. Traditionally, the mob had controlled gambling, unions, and smuggling in major cities like New York and Chicago. But on the West Coast, their reach was limited. In Los Angeles, Italian families like the Dragna and later the LA crime family struggled to maintain influence. By the 1980s, it was La M, not the Italians, that dominated the city's underworld. The Mexican Mafia's power also had a symbolic figure who blurred the lines between the two worlds, Joe Pegleg Morgan. Though not Mexican by birth, he was of Croatian descent. Morgan became one of La M's most respected leaders. Fluent in Spanish and fiercely loyal to the gang, he built bridges between the Mexican Mafia and other organized crime groups, including the Italian mob. But his presence also highlighted a harsh truth. The Italians were no longer the undisputed gatekeepers. In California, they had to negotiate with La M if they wanted access to street-level operations. The difference between the two groups was stark. The Mafia operated through a rigid hierarchy, secret ceremonies, and a code of silence. La M, by contrast, thrived on fear, loyalty, and a willingness to kill without hesitation. Orders from prison filtered quickly to the streets, enforced by armies of young Latino gang members. Drug dealers across Los Angeles paid taxes not to the Mafia, but to La M. Those who resisted were swiftly eliminated. By the 1990s, law enforcement recognized the shift. The Italian Mafia was still a major player in New York and other East Coast cities, but in the West, the Mexican Mafia was supreme. Federal investigations revealed how deeply La M had penetrated both prisons and communities. Wiretaps captured leaders giving orders from behind bars, orchestrating murders, extortion, and narcotics trafficking with terrifying efficiency. The Mafia, once feared as the ultimate underworld power, now found itself outflanked in territories it could never fully control. The Italians may have had history, connections, and national structure, but La M had numbers, fear, and dominance where it mattered most, in prisons and on the streets. Today, the Mexican Mafia remains one of the most feared criminal organizations in America. Despite countless prosecutions, their structure ensures survival. Younger recruits continue to replenish their ranks, and their ability to command street gangs gives them influence the Mafia can no longer match. The clash between La M and the Italian Mafia was not a single war, but a long, slow shift in the balance of power. On the East Coast, the Italians still held sway. But in California, the Mexican Mafia rose to become the new kings of organized crime, proving that the Mafia's throne could be challenged and even stolen by those willing to fight without limits. The Italians once ruled the streets, but in the prisons and barrios of Los Angeles, it was La M who made the rules.